Here's what's coming up on the world today. China begins building temporary housing for survivors of earthquake in the country. Czech police are working to uncover the motive behind the country's worst ever mass shooting, which saw a 24-year-old student open fire at a university in central Prague. According to Prague police, the student shot dead his father, then opened fire in the corridors and classrooms of the building, killing 14 people and wounding 25 others. Police add that the gunman killed himself after being surrounded by the authorities. The police kept the university building sealed following the tragic incident. A day of national mourning has been declared across the Central European country to remember the victims, and Czech president has appealed for unity and said the killings should not be used to launch political attacks or spread misinformation. Meanwhile, students and residents gathered to pay homage to the victims of the mass shooting and lit candles outside the scene of the incident. Students barricaded themselves into rooms of the university building during the attack, and that police had to go floor by floor to get them out.
Show our respect and condolences for the events that occurred yesterday at the philosophy faculty of Charles University. We're here just to show our support, and as fellow students of a faculty that's very close to ours at the same university, we feel like the direct impact of this.
I was completely taken off guard by this. I wasn't expecting this so close, especially to me. With me even being, I was on the same street as the police when they pulled up.
This faculty is very intertwined with us. Our program involves a lot of philosophical work anyway. These students, were basically, I can call them my classmates, my colleagues, right? So what happened yesterday was, as a Czech especially, in the city center, I was on the other side of the river and hearing gunshots, pops, not knowing what's going on, and then a flurry of police cars passing by was absolutely surreal for me as a Czech who's never witnessed an event similar or close to this before.
Elsewhere, over 1.5 million deaths have been associated with antimicrobial resistance, and 250,000 deaths attributable to AMR in the WHO African region, posing an unprecedented health threat. And that's according to a new study published in the Lancet Global Health this week. The number of deaths linked to AMR in the WHO African region is higher than those caused by both HIV/AIDS and malaria, marking a pivotal shift in the health challenges facing the region. Despite the relatively low prevalence of resistance, the WHO African region had the highest burden of AMR mortality, which is partly due to the region's high burden of infection-related mortality. AMR occurs when bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites change over time and no longer respond to medicines, making infections harder to treat and increasing the risk of disease spread, severe illness, and death. From all this, we are joined now by one of the authors of the scientific paper, Althea Gray. Thank you for your time today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So firstly, give us a better understanding of what is meant by AMR and what causes this.
Yes, I think you did a really wonderful introduction. So AMR refers to when you have microbes such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites, and they no longer are adapting to the medicines that we would typically use. So that would be antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, and so on and so forth. And what is really unfortunate is that the development of these antimicrobials is one of the greatest modern medical advancements that we have, and AMR threatens to render those completely useless. And there are quite a few drivers of AMR, which I'm happy to go into, but some of the biggest ones are the misuse of antibiotic prescriptions, as well as high rates of infection, which we see quite a lot in Africa, high rates of infection there, and then also quite a large proportion comes from pollution from pharmaceutical companies and actually agriculture and farming.
And, what are some of the key findings that surprised or concerned you the most in relation to the AMR-related mortality and, of course, its impact on the region's health landscape?
Yes, of course. So one of the questions we often get is, how can there be so much AMR in Africa? And so we estimated that there were nearly 4 million infection-related deaths in Africa, and of those, over a quarter were due to bacterial antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. And so what is really interesting is that Africa actually has the lowest prevalence of resistance due to AMR. So there's not a lot of resistance actually present in the bacteria. But because there are so many infections that are occurring far more than in other regions, you actually end up seeing this really high burden of antimicrobial resistance there in the region. And so what is one positive thing that comes from this is that tools for mitigating AMR at this stage are really complementary to reducing infection burden, such as investing in vaccines and expanding primary healthcare services.
And how does the mortality rate, associated with AMR compare to other major health threats like HIV/AIDS and malaria? We do understand from the report that I read that some of the cases associated with the AMR have now surpassed the deaths caused by HIV and malaria. And what implication does this have for public health priorities in the WHO African region?
So what we found was that the number of deaths from AMR is nearly larger than HIV and AIDS and malaria combined. And so I think that it follows that AMR should be a public health priority in the WHO African region. That said, there is, as you identified, a competition for public health funds, and AMR is not the only public health crisis being faced in Africa. So what it's going to require is a careful and coordinated action between governmental and non-governmental agencies to come up with national action plans to coordinate these efforts and utilize what I mentioned before, which is those complementary tools that target both infection as well as AMR at the same time.
Right, and share your thoughts with us on, the aftermath of this. Do you believe that renewed investments in vaccine development and distribution can help, to contribute to mitigating the impact of AMR in the region?
Oh, definitely. So the first thing that vaccines will help us do is reduce the burden of AMR by reducing the number of infectious deaths. So that will cause immediate relief. And then secondly, the long-term goal is to escape from this race of developing antibiotics that will ultimately become resistant in the future should we keep using them. And so hopefully with those two factors combined, vaccines in the long term will help AMR quite a bit, or reduce the burden of it.
Yes, certainly. So the report also highlights, some challenges in surveillance, particularly in low-resource settings. How can these challenges be addressed?
So the best tool that we have is being able to build and expand laboratory capacity and infrastructure and building microbiological facilities, because that is where we get our data from that directly impacts our estimates and makes them better so we can best target the problem. However, these are expensive tasks. And so again, it comes back to those concerted efforts and financial plans to achieve them. There were some fantastic strides in surveillance that came through COVID-19. So potential avenues could be training personnel to also look for the 4 leading pathogens, which include Streptococcus pneumoniae, Klebsiella pneumoniae, Escherichia coli or E. coli, and Staphylococcus aureus, once those tools are available.
Right, and looking ahead, what do you consider, the most critical steps and priorities for both researchers and, of course, policymakers to combat the growing issue of antimicrobial resistance in the region?
So I think the first issue to address is that infection burden. We want to bring about the most immediate relief, so that can be done through, as we just discussed, through vaccines, through being about an expansion of primary healthcare services, as well as incorporating greater access to safe water and sanitation. And then secondly, we do want to see that expansion of the laboratory services so that we can get better information, so we can have a better picture of what's going on in Africa And then thirdly, it's developing that national awareness, so coordinating those national action plans and making those strides in laboratory and vaccine development easier to achieve.
Right. We must thank you for your time today and for giving us, a broad spectrum on what we're doing to combat this menace in the region.
Yes, thank you so much.
Let's move on. As part of relief efforts, China is building hundreds of temporary housing for survivors of Monday's deadly earthquake. According to authorities, 415 movable plank housing units were built in Maple Village, Jinshan County, in Gansu for the displaced residents. Authorities expect a total of 500 units to be completed by the end of the day. The 6.2 magnitude quake that struck just before midnight on Monday killed over 130 people, injured nearly 1,000, and left survivors facing months of uncertainty ahead without permanent shelter. More than 200,000 homes were wrecked and nearly 15,000 collapsed, affecting more than 145,000 people. Food emergency supply items, including tents, kilts, tent lights and, of course, folding beds have been delivered to the victims. Well, in Canada, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, says the federal government will give more than 471 million Canadian dollars to Toronto, the country's largest city, to help it build more housing and alleviate a shelter crisis. Mr. Trudeau said the money would allow Toronto to fast-track nearly 12,000 new housing units for the next 3 years. As part of a deal with the federal government, Toronto will work to streamline zoning bylaw approvals, expand affordable rental programs, and unlock non-market housing.
Through this funding, Toronto will make it easier to get projects rolling by simplifying rezoning requirements and modernizing regulations. It'll also update old zoning rules. It'll expand existing affordable rental programs, and it'll build more homes near transit. With today's agreement, the City of Toronto will fast-track 12,000 new homes over the next 3 years and well over 50,000 new homes over the next decade. Building a better future is hard work. Building hundreds of thousands of homes across the country is hard work. Conservative politicians think we can solve a complex issue like housing with a simplistic video. But that's not serious. The Conservative Party keeps voting against funding for housing. If it were up to them, we would not be here today.
Meanwhile, the White House has made large investments in supporting small businesses over the last few years post-COVID, but many black businesses have not been able to leverage those resources to support their businesses. The Biden administration, in collaboration with the U.S. Black Commerce, announced new initiatives to address the resource gap between black and majority-owned businesses. Our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, spoke with the president and CEO of U.S. Black Chambers, Ron Busby, in response to the recent trips by President Joe Biden to address black-owned business needs in the U.S.
Mr. Busby, we thank you so much for taking the time to join us and for the work that you all have been doing to really talk about Black commerce as we look at our African American community and what it means to own a business and what it means to have a small business. I was listening not too long ago to, I think it was either some type of a clip on YouTube which says that so many of us spend more time hustling than really having our own business. Tell us a little bit more about what it means to own a business, what the Biden-Harris administration plans to do to really ensure that African Americans are not just naming and calling themselves a business, but really able to take advantage of what it means to be a business in the U.S.
That's a great segue. Thank you for having us. It has been somewhat of a historic day for this administration. President Biden started the conversation off by having a statement that many of us have heard before, saying, I want to dance with the partner that brought me here. And for us, that's black voters. We know that up until the commitment from Congressman Clyburn, his numbers were somewhat suspect. And then based upon that endorsement, I think it catapulted him to now become the president of the United States. I think the portion of your conversation in reference to what it means to have a business versus that of a hustler, I think what we have got to distill is that Black businesses are small business. It's not the case at all. Although the majority of our businesses are small, less annualized revenue, less than $150,000 a year or roughly there, we've got to think about having size and scale. I do a lot of advocating on behalf of Black-owned businesses across the country in both the private sector as well as the public sector. And many times I hear, well, Ron, I do more business with Black firms, but there are two challenges. The first one, we can't find them. And the second one is they don't have the size and the scale. And so the U.S. Black Chamber is here to make sure that we remove or at least try to decrease the barriers that are out there for Black-owned businesses. And so on the first hand, in reference to being able to find us, the U.S. Black Chamber created the only national director of certified Black-owned businesses. And let me repeat that. The only directory, the only place you can go and be certified as a Black-owned business. Historically, you could be certified as an Asian business. You could be certified as a woman-owned business, a disabled business, and even a gay and or lesbian-owned business. But when it came to a Black-owned business, you were certified as a minority business. I always say, I'm not a minority. I was Black when I woke up this morning. I'm Black as I have this interview. I'll be Black when I go to bed tonight. For the first time, this country's history, the U.S. Black Chamber said before President Biden was President Biden, we said, Mr. Biden, we're interested in three things as it relates to the Black spend. Often we hear about President Biden saying we're going to take the minority spend from 11% to 15%. And we were saying that doesn't mean anything in our community. How much of that is going to Black-owned businesses? And what we heard, the Asian community received 1.8% of the minority spend. The Hispanic community received 1.75, 1.76%. And the Black community, after all these years of voting, of paying taxes, of even paying tithes, we received 1.5% of the minority spend. And so the question was asked, well, where's all this minority spending going? And it was going to white women.
Well, Mr. Busby, we thank you so much. We definitely would love to continue our conversation, especially as we look at some of the efforts that the U.S. has done around the U.S.-Africa trade relations. And so we would love to talk to you again. But best of luck, and we thank you for your time today.
Thank you, and have a great holiday season as well.
Welcome back. We talk some sports now. Will Europe get a new soccer league on Thursday? Well, the European Court of Justice in a landmark ruling paved the way for a possible European Super League. For years, some European clubs had planned to form such a league, but FIFA and UEFA had blocked the endeavors. We have the DW's Mattis Richmond in Berlin to talk about what happened there. Mattis, first off, bring us up to speed on this new league for soccer in Europe.
Yeah, so already in April 2021, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Juventus, and 9 other leading clubs here in Europe announced they wanted to form their own league, breaking away from the closely followed Champions League. But fans in many countries reacted with outcry over the plans and forced many of the initial breakaway clubs out of the alliance. The idea was to create a semi-closed league format that would have allowed the big teams to put their finances on a more stable footing. Importantly, clubs like Bayern Munich or Borussia Dortmund here in Germany had opposed the idea early on, also because their members wouldn't have liked to see less competition in such a new league format.
That is, some European clubs had planned to form such a league, but FIFA and UEFA had blocked the endeavors. So what else is happening there?
Yeah, so especially Real and Barca still hope to go ahead with a new league, but UEFA The FIFA sports body that hosts the Champions League really didn't like to have a rival competition and blocked their teams from entering such a new league. And that had the rebel clubs and an especially created management company take the case to a Spanish court because they saw infringement on competition rules. And that's where the European Court of Justice came in and ruled that UEFA and FIFA contravened EU law by preventing a formation of a Super League and that they abused their dominant position by forbidding their clubs to compete in the ESL. Importantly, the court said the judgment didn't necessarily mean the project must be approved, rather it interpreted EU law.
And could you tell us a little bit more about the European Court of Justice and why it was necessary that it got involved?
Yeah, so the case is actually quite exemplary for how EU law works in the EU. So the Spanish court had sought guidance from the Luxembourg-based top European court. The Court of Justice of the European Union is the supreme court in matters of European law. That means it decides if institutions of the EU are acting legally, ensures that member states comply with EU treaties, and that's what happened here, interprets EU law at the request of national courts. For football, the ruling means that European clubs can join another league here in Europe without the threat of sanctions. The company driving the breakaway league already put a new proposal on the table right after the ruling, claiming to have freed European clubs from the UEFA's monopoly.
Right, Mattis, thank you for an update on that situation. Let's move on. As tensions between France and Niger escalates, France has announced it's closing its embassy in Niger indefinitely. Explaining this, the French embassy said it's no longer able to function or fulfill its mission due to restrictions imposed by Niger's military government. Niger's relationship with France has soured since the military ousted democratically elected President Mohamed Bazoum in a coup d'etat in July this year. The former French ambassador Sylvain Ité also noted that the local embassy staff have been dismissed as the consulate came under attack by thousands of the ruling junta's supporters who called for withdrawal of French troops from Niger soil. The Malian ambassador to Algiers has been summoned to the Algerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to discuss the latest developments in the situation in the sub-Saharan country. This is coming a day after Bamako summoned the Algerian ambassador to Mali. On Wednesday, the Algerian ambassador in Bamako was summoned by the Malian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Algiers was accused of holding meetings with Tuareg separatists without involving the Malian authorities. However, Algiers argued that recent meetings with the leaders of the signatory movements of the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement in Mali resulting from the Algiers process were for peaceful purposes. Algeria shares around 1,400 kilometers of borders with its southern neighbor Mali, a poor, landlocked country in the heart of the Sahel, which was rocked by two military coups in August 2020 and in May 2021. This political crisis goes hand in hand with the serious security crisis that has been underway since 2012 and the outbreak of independence and jihadist insurgencies. The UN Security Council has unanimously adopted a resolution 2719 on the financing of the African Union-led peace support operations, OPSUS, which was authored by Gabon, Ghana, and Mozambique, also known as the A3. Speaking after the vote, Michel Javier Biang, Gabonese ambassador, said every time the council meets, it shows that it's a rampart and deterrent against war, and it revives hope for future generations. Also addressing the council, Ambassador of Mozambique, Pedro Comisario Afonso, said the framework resolution would translate objectives to address the concerns of Africa that have been pending for years. For his part, U.S. diplomat Robert Wood emphasized that these operations must include appropriate safeguards for the protection of civilians. The resolution also requests the Secretary General, in consultations with the chairperson of the African Union Commission, to submit a joint report to the United Nations Security Council every 6 months on the status of implementation of the mandate that the United Nations Security Council authorizes for the conduct of any African Union-led peace support operations within the framework.
Work resolution just adopted translates our objective to address the concerns of Africa that have been pending for many years. At its core is the need to give appropriate responses to the growing and evolving security challenges on the African continent. Challenges that comprise conflicts, insurgency, progressive Africanization of terrorism, and the proliferation of extremist armed groups.
As we look to the future, we want to take a moment to highlight a few key elements of this resolution. First, it underscores the primacy of politics and the need for a coherent political strategy to guide any operation. Second, it notes that any support to AU PSOs must be in full compliance with the UN's human rights due diligence policy. Third, it emphasizes that these operations must include appropriate safeguards for the protection of civilians. And fourth, it outlines that any PSO receiving UN-assessed contributions will be authorized by and ultimately accountable to this Council for implementation of its mandate and to the GA for appropriate and reasonable use of funds.
Well, in Kenya, dazzling decorations are helping residents in the capital, Nairobi, celebrate the Christmas season. For many, 2023 has been a tough year, and some residents in the country's capital say they are trying to make ends meet at a time when they would normally travel outside the city and spend time with friends and family. This year, the Kenyan government imposed strict new tax laws, increasing the cost of living and causing citizens to feel the pinch deep in their pockets. Adverse weather conditions struck the country late November, with the El Nino flooding that killed 120 people and forced almost 90,000 households to leave their homes. But many Kenyans are still determined to share the joy and warmth of the festive season.
Traveling is fun for me. So I'm looking forward to traveling, of course, and the festives that come along with the Christmas season. I'm also looking forward to the Christmas because, you know, it's a season where you meet most of the people you haven't seen in the course of the year. On the other side, I'm still feeling a bit reluctant because the financial constraint, the economy is a bit high. So doing shopping, of course, you're wondering, where do you start? Of course, most of the things you could afford with little amount. Today, you're doing it with a lot of money, and that makes budgeting quite difficult. So that's a dilemma I'm having for this season, which makes it quite difficult to celebrate as I would want it.
The rains now, they have spoiled the roads, there are floods, and that means communication is very difficult. And the economy, again, has affected it. So we can't buy much as we used to, even to give to relatives when you go home or something. Those are the issues I see in this Christmas as being very different from the previous Christmases.
The plan for this year's Christmas is wake up, make food in our pajamas, eat together, and of course give back to the community by donating some of what we have and sharing some of our food.
And finally, on the program, hundreds of people dressed in Santa Claus outfits came out to bring Christmas cheer to passers-by in Tokyo's bustling business and shopping district. The Santas, mostly office workers from the area, traded their business attire for Santa suits to take part in the event at the Marunouchi district near Tokyo Station. This year's annual event saw the return of gift giving and increased interactions after being limited to only a cleanup activity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Organizers said 294 people from 41 companies signed up to participate and dress up as Santa Claus for the event. Merry Christmas to you too. Well, that's our show today. Thank you for watching. I'm Joke Rogers.